The grand ballroom at Buckingham Palace sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as hundreds of distinguished guests mingled in their finest evening wear. The annual Royal Charity Gala was one of the most important events of the year, bringing together members of the royal family, world leaders, celebrities, and philanthropists from across the globe. Tonight was special because it marked the first time in years that the entire royal family would appear together publicly since the recent controversies that had shaken the monarchy. Charles stood near the main entrance, adjusting his black bow tie nervously as he watched guests filter into the magnificent room. At 74, he had attended countless such events, but tonight felt different. The weight of recent family tensions pressed heavily on his shoulders. The past few months had been particularly challenging for the royal family, with constant media scrutiny and public criticism about various personal and political matters. Camilla stood beside him, radiant in a deep blue evening gown that complemented her silver hair perfectly. She had been his constant support through the difficult times, always knowing exactly what to say to calm his nerves. Her presence usually brought him peace, but tonight even her reassuring smile couldn't ease the knot in his stomach. "You look worried, darling," Camilla whispered softly, placing her gloved hand gently on his arm. "Everything will be fine tonight. We've prepared for this." Charles nodded, but his eyes kept scanning the room for his family members. He spotted William and Catherine entering through the side entrance, and his heart lifted slightly. Catherine looked absolutely stunning in an emerald green gown that seemed to catch every light in the room. Her warm smile as she greeted guests reminded him of Diana's natural grace and charm with people. The relationship between Charles and Catherine had always been somewhat complex. She represented everything he wished he could have been as a younger royal: effortlessly charming, genuinely caring, and deeply loved by the public. While he respected her immensely, there was always an underlying tension, perhaps born from his awareness that she possessed the natural royal qualities that he had struggled to develop over decades. As the evening progressed, various speeches were made about the charitable causes being supported. Charles delivered his own address about environmental conservation, one of his lifelong passions. The audience applauded politely, but he could sense their attention wasn't fully engaged. He had grown accustomed to this lukewarm reception over the years, though it never stopped stinging slightly. During dinner, Charles found himself seated at the main table with Camilla to his right, and Catherine diagonally across from him. Throughout the meal, he couldn't help but notice how Catherine effortlessly engaged with everyone around her. She asked thoughtful questions about their work, remembered personal details from previous conversations, and made each person feel genuinely heard and valued. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" commented the elderly philanthropist seated next to Charles, nodding toward Catherine. "The way she connects with people is extraordinary. Very much like her late mother-in-law in that regard." The comparison to Diana struck Charles unexpectedly. He watched Catherine laugh at something William had whispered to her, and for a moment he was transported back 30 years to similar events where Diana had captivated rooms with her authentic warmth and compassion. After dinner, the evening's entertainment began with a classical music performance by the London Symphony Orchestra. The lights dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere in the vast ballroom. Charles found himself lost in thought as the beautiful melodies filled the air. He reflected on his journey as a royal, the mistakes he had made, the relationships he had damaged, and the constant struggle to live up to public expectations. During the intermission, guests moved about the room, networking and socializing. Charles noticed Catherine standing alone near the large windows overlooking the palace gardens, taking a brief moment to herself. The moonlight streaming through the glass created an almost ethereal glow around her. Something about her solitary figure struck him deeply. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility he recognized in her posture, or the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. William was across the room deep in conversation with several foreign dignitaries, and Camilla had been pulled into a discussion about her literacy charity work. For a rare moment, Charles felt compelled to approach Catherine privately. As he walked toward her, he noticed how she gazed out at the gardens with a somewhat wistful expression. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Charles said softly as he joined her by the window. Catherine turned and smiled warmly. "It's beautiful, Your Majesty. I was just thinking about how peaceful it looks out there compared to the energy in here." "Yes, I often find myself drawn to these windows during events. Sometimes the quiet of the gardens calls to me more than the chatter of the ballroom." Charles studied her profile as she looked back outside. "You handle all of this remarkably well, Catherine. The pressure, the scrutiny, the constant demands. I hope you know how much your dedication means to the family." Catherine turned to face him fully, surprise evident in her eyes. Charles rarely spoke to her so personally or openly. "Thank you, Your Majesty. That means a great deal coming from you. I know this life isn't always easy." Even after all these years, there was something in her tone that touched him, a recognition of shared struggle, an understanding of the unique burdens they both carried. For the first time in years, Charles felt truly seen and understood by someone within his own family. "You know," Charles continued, his voice dropping even lower, "there are times when I wonder if I've made the right choices throughout my life, whether I've served the crown and the people as well as I should have." Catherine's expression softened with genuine empathy. "I think we all have those moments of doubt, but what matters is that you never stopped trying, never stopped caring about your duty and your people. That's what I see when I watch you work." Her words struck something deep within Charles. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such genuine understanding and kindness? When had someone looked past his mistakes and seen his intentions? The orchestra began preparing for the second half of the performance, and guests started moving back toward their seats. Charles knew this intimate moment would end soon, but he found himself reluctant to break away from this connection he felt with Catherine. "We should probably return to our seats," Catherine said gently, though she seemed equally reluctant to end their conversation. "Yes, of course." Charles hesitated for a moment, then added, "Catherine, I want you to know that I see how much you give to this family and this role. You bring something special to the royal family, something we've needed for a long time." A genuine smile spread across Catherine's face, and Charles felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. As they began walking back toward the main seating area, he realized that this conversation had shifted something fundamental in how he saw her, and perhaps how he saw himself. The second half of the performance featured a beautiful piece about hope and renewal, themes that resonated deeply with Charles as he sat listening. He glanced occasionally at Catherine, who seemed equally moved by the music. There was something about sharing this artistic moment after their personal conversation that felt significant. As the evening began winding down, Charles felt a strange mix of emotions. The gala had been successful by all external measures, but internally something had changed for him. His conversation with Catherine had awakened feelings he hadn't expected, not romantic feelings, but something deeper about connection, understanding, and the possibility of genuine relationships within the complex structure of royal life. When the final applause died down and guests began preparing to leave, Charles knew that this evening would remain with him long after the last guest departed. The way Catherine had listened to him, understood his struggles, and offered genuine compassion had touched something in his heart that had felt closed off for years. As he stood to escort Camilla from their table, Charles caught Catherine's eye across the room one final time. She offered him a small, knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge the special moment they had shared. In that brief exchange, Charles realized that his relationship with his daughter-in-law had fundamentally changed. though he couldn't yet understand what that might mean for the future. The weeks following the Royal Charity Gala brought an unexpected change to the dynamics within the royal family. Charles found himself thinking frequently about his conversation with Catherine, replaying her words of understanding and support in his mind. For the first time in years, he had felt truly heard by someone who understood the unique pressures of royal life. These thoughts began to influence his behavior in subtle ways. During family meetings, Charles found his eyes naturally drifting toward Catherine, seeking her reactions and opinions. He began specifically asking for her input on various matters, something he had rarely done before. William noticed this shift, but attributed it to his father finally recognizing Catherine's value to the family. Catherine, for her part, was initially surprised by Charles's increased attention and interest in her perspective. She had always felt somewhat on the periphery of his inner circle, knowing that while he respected her role, he had never been particularly close to her personally. This new dynamic was both flattering and slightly confusing, but she welcomed the opportunity to contribute more meaningfully to family discussions. Camilla observed these changes with growing unease. She had been Charles's primary confidant and advisor for years, and suddenly she noticed him turning to Catherine more frequently. During private conversations, Charles would reference things Catherine had said or suggest ideas that clearly came from their discussions. "You seem to value Catherine's opinion quite highly these days," Camilla mentioned one evening as they prepared for bed in their private quarters. Charles paused in removing his cufflinks. "She has a fresh perspective on things. Her connection with the public gives her insights that I find valuable." "You've never been particularly interested in my insights about public connection," Camilla replied, trying to keep her tone light but unable to hide a note of concern. Charles looked at her with surprise. "That's not true, Camilla. Your work with literacy and domestic violence awareness has been invaluable. This is simply different." But even as he said the words, Charles realized there was truth in Camilla's observation. Something about Catherine's understanding of his personal struggles had created a connection he craved. When Catherine spoke to him about royal duty and service, he felt validated and understood in a way that went beyond professional respect. The situation became more complex during a family weekend at Balmoral. The entire extended royal family gathered for their traditional autumn retreat, a time meant for relaxation and family bonding away from public scrutiny. The Scottish Highlands provided a beautiful backdrop for long walks, family dinners, and informal conversations. On the second day, Charles suggested a walking tour of the estate's conservation projects. These environmental initiatives were particularly close to his heart, and he was eager to show the family the progress that had been made. William and Catherine enthusiastically agreed to join, along with several other family members. During the walk, Charles found himself naturally gravitating toward Catherine, explaining the various sustainable practices they had implemented and seeking her thoughts on how to better communicate these efforts to the public. Catherine's genuine interest and thoughtful questions energized him in a way he hadn't expected. "The tree planting initiative you started here could be a wonderful model for communities across the Commonwealth," Catherine suggested, as they stood overlooking a newly forested hillside. "Perhaps we could create educational materials that local schools could use." Charles's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That's a brilliant idea, Catherine. You have such an instinct for connecting environmental work with community engagement." William walked slightly ahead, pleased to see his father and wife finding common ground. But Camilla fell further behind the group, feeling increasingly excluded from Charles's attention and excitement. That evening during dinner, the family gathered around the large wooden table in the castle's informal dining room. The atmosphere was relaxed, with conversations flowing freely about the day's activities. Charles, sitting at the head of the table with Camilla to his right and Catherine several seats down, found himself directing most of his comments and questions toward Catherine. "Catherine, What did you think of the renewable energy systems we saw today? Charles asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. I was particularly impressed with the water conservation methods, Catherine replied thoughtfully. I think there's real potential to adapt those techniques for urban environments. Their conversation continued throughout the meal, with Charles building on Catherine's ideas and sharing his own experiences from decades of environmental work. The connection was intellectual and passionate, but there was also something more personal in the way Charles hung on her every word. Other family members began to notice the shift. Anne, Charles's sister, raised an eyebrow as she watched her brother's animated discussion with Catherine. William seemed pleased, but slightly puzzled by his father's intense focus on his wife's opinions. Camilla sat quietly, picking at her food and offering only brief responses when directly addressed. She had supported Charles through his most difficult years, had been there during his struggles with public opinion, family conflicts, and personal doubts. Now she felt herself being gradually pushed to the sidelines as Charles found a new source of intellectual and emotional connection. The next morning, Catherine woke early and decided to take a solitary walk through the estate grounds. She needed time to process the unexpected intensity of Charles's attention over the past few days. While she was flattered by his newfound interest in her perspectives, she was also somewhat uncomfortable with the way it seemed to exclude Camilla. As she walked along the path by the river, Catherine heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Charles approaching, dressed in his walking clothes and carrying a thermos of coffee. I hoped I might find you out here, Charles said as he caught up to her. I brought coffee. If you'd like some. They sat on a large stone overlooking the rushing water, sipping coffee in comfortable silence for several minutes. The morning mist hung over the valley, creating an almost magical atmosphere around them. Catherine, Charles began carefully, I want you to know how much our conversations have meant to me recently. For years I've felt somewhat isolated in my role even within the family. Your understanding and insights have been a gift. Catherine felt a flutter of concern at his earnest tone. Your Majesty, I'm honored that you value my perspective. But I hope you know that Camilla's support and wisdom have been invaluable to you and to the family for many years. Charles was quiet for a moment, staring at the water. Yes, of course, Camilla has been wonderful. It's just that you understand certain aspects of this life in a way that... He trailed off, realizing how his words might sound. In a way that she doesn't? Catherine finished gently. Charles looked at her with surprise at her directness. Perhaps. You came into this family as an outsider, as I did in many ways. You've had to prove yourself, to win over skeptics, to find your place. Camilla's path was different. Catherine chose her next words carefully. Your Majesty, I think every member of this family has had to find their own way of serving and contributing. Camilla's journey may have been different from mine, but her dedication and love for you and for the institution have never wavered. Her gentle correction struck Charles deeply. He realized that in his excitement about this new connection with Catherine, he was being unfair to Camilla, who had stood by him through his darkest hours and most difficult decisions. You're right, of course, Charles said quietly. I suppose I've been caught up in the novelty of feeling understood in new ways. But you're absolutely right about Camilla's dedication. They finished their coffee in thoughtful silence, both aware that something significant had been discussed and acknowledged. As they walked back toward the castle, Catherine hoped she had helped Charles recognize what he might be risking in his marriage by pursuing this intense connection with her. However, despite Catherine's gentle warning and his own recognition of the truth in her words, Charles found himself unable to pull back from this new emotional connection. Throughout the rest of the weekend, he continued seeking her out for conversations, asking her opinion on various matters, and finding excuses to spend time in her company. The situation reached a turning point on the final evening of the family gathering. The group had gathered in the main drawing room for after-dinner drinks and casual conversation. William was engaged in a discussion about sports with some of the younger family members, while Camilla sat with Anne talking about upcoming charitable commitments. Charles found himself once again drawn into conversation with Catherine about a book they had both recently read about sustainable development. Their discussion was animated and intellectually stimulating, touching on philosophy, environmental policy, and social responsibility. "I've never had someone who could discuss these ideas with such depth and understanding," Charles said, leaning closer to Catherine on the sofa where they sat. "It's refreshing to share these thoughts with someone who truly grasps their significance." Catherine felt a moment of alarm at his words and proximity. "Your Majesty, surely Camilla shares your passion for many causes. Her work has been remarkable." "Yes, but it's different with you," Charles insisted, his voice dropping lower. "You see things the way I see them. You understand not just the work, but the deeper meaning behind it." The intensity in his voice made Catherine uncomfortable, and she glanced around the room, hoping someone might interrupt their conversation. Instead, she noticed Camilla watching them from across the room, her expression unreadable but clearly strained. At that moment, William approached their corner of the room. "Father, Catherine, you two look very serious over here, discussing world affairs again." "Your wife has a remarkable mind, William," Charles replied, his eyes still fixed on Catherine. "I hope you appreciate what an exceptional woman you married." William smiled, but Catherine caught a flicker of confusion in his expression. "Of course I do, Father. Catherine is wonderful." As the evening wound down and family members began saying their good nights, Catherine made a point of approaching Camilla privately. "Camilla, I hope you know how much I admire the support you give to His Majesty," Catherine said sincerely. "Your partnership means everything to him and to the family." Camilla studied Catherine's face carefully. "Thank you, dear. That's kind of you to say. I know Charles enjoys your conversations very much." There was something in Camilla's tone that told Catherine her concerns were justified. The dynamic that had developed between her and Charles was beginning to affect his marriage, and Catherine knew she needed to find a way to address it before things went too far. The weeks following the Balmoral gathering brought an escalation of tension that no one in the royal family had anticipated. Charles's growing emotional dependence on Catherine's understanding and support had begun to consume his thoughts and influence his daily decisions. What had started as intellectual admiration had evolved into something far more complex and concerning. William began noticing subtle changes in family dynamics during their regular meetings. His father, who had always maintained formal boundaries with Catherine, now seemed to light up whenever she entered a room. Charles would defer to her opinions, seek her approval, and find ways to include her in discussions where her presence wasn't necessarily required. Catherine herself felt increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She had tried to gently redirect Charles's attention back to Camilla and his other family relationships, but her efforts seemed only to intensify his focus on her. She found herself dreading family gatherings that had once been enjoyable, knowing that Charles would monopolize her attention and create awkward situations. The crisis came to a head during the annual Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey. The event was one of the most significant on the royal calendar, with thousands of attendees and global media coverage. Every detail of the royal family's behavior would be scrutinized and analyzed by experts and the public alike. The family gathered in the private vestry before the service to review the processional order and discuss any last-minute details. Charles stood with his notes, going over the ceremony's significance and their roles in the service. Camilla, elegant in a deep purple ensemble, stood supportively at his side as she had for countless such events over the years. Catherine arrived with William, wearing a stunning navy coat dress that commanded attention without being ostentatious. She offered polite greetings to everyone present, but Charles's reaction to her entrance was noticeably different from his response to other family members. "Catherine, how wonderful you look today," Charles said, his voice carrying in warmth that made several family members glance up from their preparations. "That color is absolutely perfect for you." Camilla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, while William looked puzzled by his father's effusive greeting. Catherine thanked Charles politely, but quickly moved to discuss practical matters about the service with other family members. During the final preparations before processing into the Abbey, disaster struck in the most public way possible. The family was arranged in their processional order, with Charles and Camilla positioned to lead the group down the aisle. Thousands of people packed the Abbey, millions more watched on television around the world, and photographers captured every moment. As the music began, and the doors opened to reveal the packed cathedral, Charles felt a surge of emotion. The weight of the ceremony, the pressure of public scrutiny, and his recent internal turmoil combined to create a moment of overwhelming vulnerability. Instead of drawing strength from Camilla, who stood ready beside him, Charles's mind immediately went to Catherine and the emotional support she had been providing. In that critical moment, as cameras flashed and the world watched, Charles instinctively reached out for the person who had become his emotional anchor over recent weeks. His hand extended not toward Camilla, his wife and partner of many years, but toward Catherine, who stood several feet behind them in the processional line. The motion was captured by dozens of cameras from multiple angles. Charles's hand stretched past Camilla, clearly seeking Catherine's touch, while his eyes fixed on her with an expression of desperate need for connection. The entire room seemed to freeze as people processed what they were witnessing. Catherine's face went pale as she realized what was happening. The impropriety of the gesture, the public nature of the moment, and the devastating impact on Camilla all hit her simultaneously. She remained perfectly still, neither stepping forward to accept Charles's reach, nor making any gesture that could be misinterpreted. Camilla stood as if turned to stone, watching her husband publicly reach past her for another woman during one of the most sacred and formal ceremonies of their royal calendar. Her years of training in maintaining composure served her well. But those closest to her could see the profound hurt and shock in her eyes. William reacted with the quick thinking that had been drilled into him since childhood. He smoothly stepped forward, placed his hand on his father's shoulder, and guided him gently back to his proper position beside Camilla. "The processional is beginning, Father," William murmured quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to break through Charles's confused state. Charles blinked as if waking from a trance, suddenly realizing where he was and what he had almost done. The magnitude of his error crashed over him like a cold wave. He looked at Camilla, whose face maintained perfect composure even as her eyes reflected deep pain and confusion. "Camilla, Charles began, but she simply offered her arm and nodded toward the aisle where their processional needed to begin. The ceremony proceeded as planned, but the damage was done. Every person in that abbey had witnessed the King of England reach past his wife for his daughter-in-law during a solemn religious service. The implications were staggering for both the royal family's public image and their private relationships. Throughout the service, Catherine felt physically ill. She had tried so hard to prevent exactly this kind of situation, and now her worst fears had been realized in the most public way possible. She could feel the stares and whispered conversations throughout the abbey as people processed what they had witnessed. After the service, the family returned to Buckingham Palace in heavy silence. The car ride with William was particularly difficult for Catherine, as she struggled to explain something she herself didn't fully understand. "Catherine, what was that about?" William asked quietly once they were alone in their vehicle. "Why did Father reach for you like that?" "I don't know, William," Catherine replied honestly, her voice shaking slightly. "He's been seeking my advice more frequently lately, but I never imagined it would lead to something like this." William studied his wife's face carefully. "Is there something I should know about your relationship with my father?" Nothing inappropriate has ever happened between us, Catherine said firmly. But I think he's been going through some kind of emotional crisis, and somehow I became a source of support for him. I've tried to encourage him to lean on Camilla instead. But he kept turning to you anyway, William finished, beginning to understand the impossible position his wife had been placed in. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla rode in their official car in complete silence. The weight of what had just occurred hung heavy between them. Charles stared out the window, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, horrified by his own actions. "Camilla, I am so deeply sorry," Charles finally whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know what came over me. I never meant to hurt you or embarrass our family." Camilla continued looking straight ahead, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Charles, I have stood by you through everything. Every scandal, every criticism, every difficult moment. I have never asked for much except your loyalty and respect." "You have both," Charles said desperately. "You've always had both." "Have I?" Camilla turned to look at him, tears finally visible in her eyes. "Because what I just witnessed suggests otherwise. In front of the entire world, you reached for another woman instead of your wife." The car fell silent again as both struggled with the enormity of what had just happened. Charles realized that his growing emotional attachment to Catherine had led him to the brink of destroying his marriage and humiliating his wife in the most public way possible. That evening, an emergency family meeting was called. Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine gathered in the private sitting room at Buckingham Palace to address what had happened and determine how to move forward. Charles began with a heartfelt apology to everyone present, acknowledging that his behavior had been inappropriate and hurtful. He explained that he had been going through a difficult period emotionally and had unfairly placed Catherine in the position of being his primary source of support and understanding. "I have no excuse for what happened today," Charles said, his voice heavy with shame. "My actions were wrong, and they've hurt the people I care about most. Camilla, you deserved so much better from me, especially in such a public moment." Catherine spoke next, expressing her own regret about the situation. "I should have been more direct about redirecting Your Majesty's attention back to your family and existing support systems. I never wanted to come between anyone or cause any pain." William listened to both explanations before speaking. "Father, I think you need to honestly examine what's been driving this behavior. Catherine is my wife, your daughter-in-law, and a working member of our family, but she cannot and should not be your primary emotional support. That role belongs to Camilla." The conversation continued for hours as they worked through the complex emotions and dynamics that had led to this crisis. Charles acknowledged that he had been unfairly expecting Catherine to fill emotional needs that should have been addressed within his marriage or through professional support. Camilla, with grace that impressed everyone present, expressed her willingness to work through the situation, but made clear that significant changes would need to occur for their marriage to recover from this betrayal. Over the following weeks, Charles sought counseling to understand what had driven his emotional attachment to Catherine and how to rebuild his relationship with Camilla. Catherine made a conscious effort to maintain appropriate boundaries and redirect any inappropriate attention from Charles back to his wife. The public never learned the full story of what had transpired, but the image of Charles reaching past Camilla for Catherine became a defining moment that people would analyze and discuss for years to come. It served as a stark reminder that even the most well-trained royals are human beings capable of profound mistakes. The incident ultimately served as a wake-up call for Charles about the importance of maintaining appropriate relationships and honoring his commitments. While it took considerable time and effort, he and Camilla were eventually able to rebuild their relationship on stronger foundations, with both parties having a clearer understanding of their needs and boundaries. Catherine emerged from the experience with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of royal relationships and a renewed commitment to maintaining appropriate boundaries with all family members. The incident, while painful for everyone involved, ultimately led to healthier dynamics within the royal family and stronger marriages for both couples.